Yeah, if you want to, I'll just wait a brief time to come back up here. So we can start, but yeah.
I'm spreading this one. Is it Rebecca? I am moving
I mean, like, yes.
Okay, you tap the bottom and then lights on, and make sure you talk into the mic. Yeah.
Okay.
That's all.
And then do I?
Like mouse pen and TV.
I think he just wanted to test
No problem.
For real, I really didn't appreciate
Let's do 6:15. Yeah. Got it. All right. Good evening, everyone. Can everybody hear me all right? All right. How's everyone doing tonight? Great. So we're going to go ahead and get started. So this workshop kind of came up as Resource Generation, which is an organization that is organizing youth with wealth and class privilege to redistribute land and wealth. And we've been running a grassroots fundraising campaign to getting a housing organizer for Durham Community Land Trust. Yes. So we've been kind of thinking about this workshop, and we wanted to put it on in efforts to kind of further education around housing and gentrification, and seeing land ownership as an integral part of wealth accumulation and inequality. So we just wanted to kind of acknowledge a couple things before we start, and then we're going to jump right into it. So the first thing is that we are new to this. We have many questions. We don't have many answers. But one thing that we definitely want to acknowledge is that we are on stolen land. So Durham rests on the land of, the Michi Band of the Pony Nation. And Durham's landscape is ever changing. And to quote Jillian Johnson, she said, "We don't want a downtown where only rich people and white people feel comfortable. Left to its own devices, this market will trend to the most money to spend in order to make downtown accessible and comfortable. There has to be more of an intentional push to maintain that racial, socio-economic diversity." So I've grown up in myself. I saw that happen in the streets that I was born and raised on. So I want to challenge that in the ways that I can in Durham. So without further ado, we're going to introduce Mel.
Hey there. So our speaker tonight is Mel Norton. She is an urban planner and public historian who has called Durham home for the past 10 years. She is currently the project director of a public history project called Bull City 150, Reckoning with Durham's Past to Build a More Equitable Future, whose award-winning exhibition on the history of housing and land inequality in Durham debuted last year. She is the board chair of the Durham Community Land Trustees, an organization that promotes permanently affordable housing, and is a founding member of Durham for All, an organizing initiative that aims to build a cross-race, cross-class, independent political vehicle, 10K strong, that is rooted in the leadership of working-class people and people of color in Durham. She lives in the Golden Belt neighborhood with her partner and 5-year-old daughter, and this is Mel.
Chewing. Good evening. Good evening. Thanks for coming out tonight. I know that there's always a lot of stuff happening in Durham, and so really appreciate you taking time out of your lives to be here. And thank you to the folks who put on this event and for the amazing work that's been going on to raise money for a position at DCLT that's going to be directly supporting and organizing DCLT's residents, the majority of whom are low income and people of color, and making DCLT the best landlord in the South, if not the nation. We're excited about that extra capacity, and it was really a pretty amazing gesture for folks to come together like that. I'm here tonight kind of wearing a lot of different hats. I'm not repping any single organization. With my paid work, I do a lot of exploration into Durham's housing and land inequality history. We did an exhibit called Uneven Ground, which we just took down from City Hall, but we're going to have an online version going up this summer. I work with DCLT, I work with Durham for All, but I think most significantly is that I'm coming up on 10 years of living in Durham, the majority of which I've spent living in a gentrified neighborhood and just deeply, daily wrestling with all that entails. So I always like to say at the very beginning before I speak on this issue that I'm not at a pedestal, I'm not on a pedestal, I'm at a podium, but I'm not on a pedestal. Kind of talking down like I really know that much more than anybody else. I think we're facing kind of a historic crisis that has its own particularities around it, and I feel very conscious and humble of that. But I do have a growth edge right now that I'm working on that I would like to share with you. I've been in dialogue with a lot of folks, particularly with the Durham for All team that I work with, about what it means to translate kind of concern for an issue or like a moral feeling about an issue into identifying what is our particular self-interest that motivates us to take action. This isn't kind of the selfish type of self-interest where you're like, oh, I'm gonna get a lot of money when I sell my house. And it's not that. It's the opposite of that. It's kind of digging deep and reaching in to identify what motivates you on a personal level, what's resonant with you about this crisis that you would show up, for example, tonight. And as I've been reflecting about that, kind of go back to my childhood and recognize that my family moved around a lot. Like I went to 9 schools before the 8th grade. And my parents got married really young and had a big family. And so they were always kind of chasing some sort of middle class aspirations. And that led to us moving a lot. And as a super shy kid, pretty nerdy, I felt a lot of upheaval and a lot of transitions and change and uprooting that I had no control over. And so as I became politicized as an adult, one of my first mentors kind of portrayed this Grace Lee Bogg quote to me where it's like, the most radical thing you can do is stay put. And that really deeply resonated with me and kind of dictated a lot of the choices that I've made in my life since then. So that's just one of the self-interest pieces that I'm wrestling with. as I think about the emotional impacts of displacement and the different ways in which people don't have control in so many instances about what happens to their home, their community, their lives. And I'd like you to just kind of in the back of your mind start to reflect on your own self-interest. For some folks, it'll be really easy, and for some folks, you might have to dig a little deeper. But we're going to come back to that towards the end of this presentation. Yay, it works. Quick outline of the presentation today. We'll be setting a little bit of context, going through a short history of how we got here. I've put together some nice maps and facts and figures that kind of describe the scope of what we're up against and what's going on. And then really briefly at the end, we're going to talk about what do we do, and then return to self-interest and political power. So to start with, I'd like to do an interactive. This was a question in a survey. Can you hear me without the microphone?
I'm gonna have to use it for the live stream.
Do I have to use it for the live stream? Okay. This was a question sent out on a survey pretty shortly after our last president was elected, where they asked people across the country, for every $100 in wealth accumulated by the average white family, how much wealth has the average black family accumulated? And they gave a few different options, and we're going to do this in this room live. So by show of hands, how many of you think that it's $100, that one for one, we're totally equal? I'm glad that nobody thinks that. What about $76 to $100? $51 to $75? No takers. $26 to $50? Okay, see some hands. What about $0 to $25? Okay. Here are the results. In a national survey, you can see the reality of family wealth by race, and the perception of what people thought it was just as far apart as statistically possible. And they asked the same questions about, family income by race, and college educated wages by race, high school wages by race. And while those were smaller gaps, there's still a pretty significant gap in the perception versus reality. And while this was true of all Americans, it was particularly true of higher income white folks. So what does that mean? I mean, I think it opens up a lot of really big questions. If we think we've made more progress than we have, how does that influence policy and decision making on every level? And what was interesting to me is that the authors of that study said, if we want people to have a better understanding of racial inequality, these results imply that the solution is not to share these statistics more widely, as I'm doing, but it's to get Americans thinking more about the forces that underlie them, which we will do next. So in the Uneven Ground exhibition, we tell the story of the history of housing and land inequality in Durham through the lens of capitalism and structural racism. In particular, we're interested in both how policies and individual actions combine to create and recreate generational inequality. And so we started with kind of the original sins, stolen land and stolen labor. Stolen land being the violent displacement of indigenous peoples of America from their land, and the stolen labor of enslaved people, both of which created the foundations of wealth and land ownership for white folks going into the future. And then we take it all the way up through the 1960s. But for today, we're really going to focus on kind of the portion of the story starting in the 1930s. So this map, all of the purple blobs on this map are the historically black neighborhoods in Durham. The biggest one on the bottom is what was referred to as the hay tie, going around counterclockwise, or I guess that's clockwise. Going around clockwise, there's the West End neighborhood. Just above that is a neighborhood called Brookstown. Up in the corner there is Hickstown. Walltown is up near the top, and then you have the East End over on the side. And there's a few other smaller settlements mixed in. What this map is trying to portray, and it's kind of hard to see, but I'll walk you through it, is the ways in which local decision-making from a very early point in Durham's history started to create very unequal environments. So those things that are circled in red are the incinerators. Before we had our trash hauled off to some faraway place, people would burn their trash. And all of the incinerators are located in historically Black neighborhoods. If you look at the spots of green on the map, you can see that there's 7 parks in white neighborhoods versus 1 in Black neighborhoods. Although Black folks represented approximately 1/3 of Durham residents at the time. And additionally, Black neighborhoods did not get sewers, paved roads, intentional tree plantings, and other public investments until much later, if at all. So local decisions. This is an image of a street in the Hayti neighborhood from the 1950s. And what I'd like you to notice about that is the unpaved roads. I don't know why it keeps popping my peas. And then over on the left side of the photo, you see an open ditch, which is essentially an open sewer. There's an open sewer with some liquid in it. In Polly Murray's Proud Shoes, she has this really rich description of what neighborhoods at that time were like. Shacks for factory workers mushroomed in the lowlands between the graded streets. These little communities, which clung precariously to the banks of streams or sat crazily on washed-out gullies and were held together by cow paths or rutted wagon tracks, were called the bottoms. It was as if the town had swallowed more than it could hold and had regurgitated. For the bottoms was an odorous conglomeration of trash piles, garbage dumps, cow stalls, pig pens, and crowded humanity. And what she's really referring to is this, if you've ridden your bike around Durham or if you've traveled, Durham has a very kind of undulating landscape. And the people with the least amount of resources were forced to live in the lowlands and the bottomlands that were prone to flooding, that had open sewers, and this really sustained for decades. This is a picture from Hayti from the 1960s, where there were still outhouses behind the worker housing, the tobacco worker housing. Sanitary sewer lines and water lines had not yet been extended to the Hayti neighborhood. However, despite this, this is a quote from Emma Johnson, a pseudonym of a book called Bull City Survivor. She says, "Looking back, I can see that we had a real sense of security. We had so many people watching out for us. You were known, your family was known, and no matter if I didn't have a lot of money, I could still bring my kids up and not give up." And in all the oral histories and recollections that I've come across, there is this kind of interesting sense where like people felt really connected and people felt really grounded in place, even if their environments were extremely neglected and disinvested in. So we had the local piece of it. Now we're going to kind of scale up to the national, how the national policy started to impact Durham. Here's a redlining map of Durham. Have any of you seen Durham's redlining map before? A handful of people. Okay. What happened in the 1930s is the federal government started to get into the housing business. After the Great Depression, there was this need for additional resources and support to get the housing market back on its feet. And through the Federal Housing Administration and later the Veterans Administration, the federal government started to realize that they wanted to know what types of investments they were making. So they sent federal agents to cities across the country, including Durham. It was over 200 cities. And they rated neighborhoods according to levels of risk for lending. And it was a color-coded system where the green and the blue were the highest rated. They were deemed the safest for risk. The yellow and the red were the most risky, with the red being the most risky. Red line was drawn around it, hence the term redlining. And so you can see in this image that all of the red line neighborhoods in Durham were the historically Black neighborhoods, and race was a specific factor in determining the the risk for a neighborhood. Other factors that played into determining the risk of neighborhoods were paved roads, sewer lines, parks and amenities, things that the local government had disinvested even before this went on. So you had decisions on the local level playing up into the federal government's lending decisions. And this is significant because in the subsequent years, the private lending market, banks, started to adopt these guidelines as well. So everybody that was in the business of giving money for homes and for investment were basically following these guidelines. Back to the local level, I think it's pretty interesting in a lot of ways as I got into this early history that Jim Crow never legislated housing. There was no rules on the books that Black people and white people had to live in separate parts of town, but yet the color line was extremely firm. And so there's a few tools that were used to ensure the color line. And one of those was deed restrictions that started to be used as kind of wealthier suburbs on the urban fringe at the time were doing larger tract developments. And they created these rules attached to the house in the form of the deed, which required minimum lot sizes. And housing costs, your house had to cost X amount of money. And so this ensured that there would be a very small range of class composition in these neighborhoods. They also explicitly disallowed the sale of houses to Black people. You can see the actual language from this 1926 deed from Hope Valley. Other neighborhoods that utilized deed restrictions were Forest Hills, Watts Hospital Hillendale, Duke Park, Glendale Heights, and several others. And I worked with a student last year who called these hidden monuments. We have these kind of Confederate monuments recently, and notably that Durham tore one down, but there's these other markers of white supremacy that are integrated into our landscape in ways that are less visible and less hard to tear down. Deed restrictions are still on the books, even though they are illegal. So if you buy a house today, that will, in one of these neighborhoods, your deed will include this language, even though it's unenforceable. The real estate industry was also responsible for institutionalizing discrimination in their practices. They bought into this idea that neighborhoods would never be stable socially or economically if they contained non-homogeneous populations. And you can see explicitly in the National Code of Ethics in 1924, a realtor should never be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood members of any race or nationality whose presence will be clearly detrimental to the values in the property values in the neighborhood. And while I think we've made a fair amount of progress, racial steering certainly still is present today. And there's been some interesting tests over the years in Durham where they do pair testing, where black person and white person go out, look the same on paper, and see where real estate agents actually take them in town. And then in the 1960s, there was another federal program that had a tremendous and traumatic impact on Durham called urban renewal, which James Baldwin famously dubbed Negro removal. And how it worked is that the federal government would give large sums of money to local governments to undertake a process called slum clearance, although slums were very, very vaguely defined. And the primary casualty in Durham was the Hayti neighborhood. Although in city after city across the country, you likewise see Black and brown neighborhoods being targeted for slum clearance. So this is an aerial photograph of Hayti before urban renewal. You can see Fayetteville Street and South Roxborough Street for reference. And just notice how dense the housing is and what a fine-grained street network there is. And this is the same area, same screenshot after urban renewal. And you can see that that entire area was quite literally wiped off the map. Only one building remains. And it was replaced very, very slowly with this kind of suburban, low density style development and public housing. This is a picture of a classic Haytide landmark called the DeShazer's Beauty Shop that was being torn down during urban renewal. It was worse than a nightmare. It was a nightmare, worse than the pictures of a war-torn out or burned out riot area. Who caused all this? Barbara Perry on returning home to Haytide during urban renewal after living up in New York for a few years. This is a photo of the construction of 147. The so-called urban renewal program is not only the biggest farce ever concocted in the history of mortal man, it's just another scheme to relieve Negroes of property. Lewis Alston, editor of the Carolina Times. Following urban renewal, Durham was in a serious housing shortage. A bunch of houses had been torn down. Very few had been replaced. And the solution at the time was to start building a lot of public housing. There was financing available from the federal government. And what's notable here is you see that the concentration of public housing is in previously existing Black neighborhoods. And there was a tremendous amount of grassroots organizing back in the day to say, wait a second, we need these resources, but these resources should be distributed all around our community and not just all put in the same place. Something else that's notable is that while white folks were increasingly given long-term low-interest mortgages through the Federal Housing Administration and the Veterans Administration, most Black folks were excluded from those homeownership opportunities and instead were given the opportunity to live in public housing, where you cannot build wealth and where the government intrudes into people's lives in ways that they don't if they're just getting a home loan. They pry into your family structure, they pry into how much you're working, and yeah. In the decades that followed, you see this cycle of disinvestment in urban neighborhoods, and in particular in historically Black neighborhoods. There's fewer residents, decline in housing stock, and more vacant properties. Less businesses and amenities like banks and grocery stores. Less investment and maintenance and services, which all leads to a deterioration of neighborhood quality of life. The infrastructure, the safety, the schools, the green spaces. And this cycled for decades. And this type of disinvestment in urban neighborhoods leads to other types of discrimination. For example, I'm very hard-pressed that we'd have our current war on drugs and this intensification of policing and police violence if we didn't have all of these things preceding it. It led to disparities in schools and educational attainment, led to disparities in health outcomes, leads to environmental racism, and we can keep going, right? These are just a few examples. And I just want to make abundantly clear that this is not the fault of the people living in these neighborhoods who've had to be very innovative and figure out lots of different ways to make life in an area that has been choked off of resources. It's the direct result of bad and discriminatory policy. So we're going to move the timeline up to today and just ask the question, what causes gentrification? Plus, 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 plus. And I added the pluses because gentrification tends to be this like big blanket term. And I think as a whole, we're struggling with a lot of things related to the sedimented impacts of this history. You know, we have the racial wealth gap, which is profound, as you saw at the beginning of this presentation. We're in an eviction crisis. We have dwindling federal and state resources. We still live in largely racially residential segregated neighborhoods. There's uneven neighborhood investments. There's lots of things happening in this moment that are of grave concern. But what's causing this? Foundation, disinvestment, and structural racism. I felt like I said that a lot, and I'm probably going to say it a few more times. Decades of disinvestment in central neighborhoods created extremely undervalued land and real estate. And then beginning in kind of the early 2000s, what we start to see is this kind of ravenous strategic investment in downtown. Incentives for development, major public amenities like theaters, streetscape projects, really setting the tone for a lot of private investment to come in. And then Durham's experienced a lot of, significant economic shifts. Historically, it was predominantly a working class town based in tobacco and textile manufacturing. And today, Durham's kind of an economic hotspot. And we have, I'm starting to hate this term, but I'm going to say it anyway, creative class workers. So people who are, in the realm of ideas. You can be involved in advertising, academia, research and design, basically anything that enables you to work with ideas. And they come with their own lifestyle preferences. A lot of folks grew up in the suburbs and they're like, really, I'd like to live in an urban neighborhood. I want to be close to amenities. I want to live in a historic house that I can fix up and that is unique and has character. And these tastes and preferences are really driving like a big market shift in where people with means want to live. And then we also have this huge influx of investment capital, like national, perhaps, I don't know, international investment capital, where these large hedge funds, large organization, put together these large portfolios of real estate in Durham. They can pay cash, and they realize that they can make a better return on their investment in local real estate than they can in the stock markets. And since Durham is growing really fast, by any measure, the Triangle is one of the fastest growing regions in the country, people have their eye kind of trained on Durham. So the next couple slides are just going to put into perspective through some visualizations what's happening and how it's playing out today. And this is a map that my colleague Tim Stallman put together for Uneven Ground, and it's a really powerful map. What it shows is the bottom layer, the green scale, is the cost of housing. So the darker areas are more expensive and the lighter areas are less expensive. And for 1970, those were adjusted for 2017 dollars. And so what you see is all over Durham, housing is literally more expensive than it's ever been. I have a comparison here to 1970. It would look even more dramatic if we took it back to 1950. So housing is really, really, really expensive. The red dots are the number of people in each census tract that are housing burdened, that are spending more than 30% of their income on housing. And you can see that there was a couple little pockets of people who were housing burdened in 1970, but there's just an explosion today. And those are people across the income spectrum. Although things always hit people hardest on the lower part of the income spectrum. This is the results of analysis I did. It's already a few years old, so it's already it's pretty low compared to what it is now. But I tracked all the sales in a couple core neighborhoods in Durham just to see how things were changing, and put all the sales prices together. If a house sold 3 times, I would count it 3 times, and then took the average price per square foot change each year. So, for example, in Walltown from 2005 to the first quarter of 2015, the average price per square foot for a house sale went up 115%. It's 112% in Old North Durham. So houses more than doubled in less than 10 years, really less than like 5 years in most cases. Cleveland Holloway went up 490%. Birch Avenue went up 160%. West End went up 112%. If we were to take these numbers to today, I'm sure they would all be, it's hard to even imagine. They'll be much higher. Let me just put it that way. So how does that impact things? This is a map that Charlie Reese and Jillian Johnson, two of our fine city council members, put together to show the increase in tax value. Durham historically has only reassessed the value of its property every 8 years. So the last one was in 2016. It hadn't been done since 2008. And what you see here is all the yellow circles are properties that increased by 100 to 200%. And the red circles are properties that increased by 200% or more. And you can see all around the central city, people are paying much higher values. The valuations are much higher in their properties, so they're paying much higher taxes. And that hits people really hard who are long-term homeowners, who are on a fixed income. And we can't do any sort of progressive taxation in North Carolina. It's very illegal. So housing prices are going through the roof, and yet wages, particularly on the low end, are almost completely stagnant. The housing wage is the wage you would need to afford a fair market 2-bedroom house in Durham, is 223% of the minimum wage, which hasn't gone up now in almost 10 years. 15,000 rental households are severely housing burdened. They pay more than 50% of their income on housing. 1/5 of Durham residents live in poverty, and there's an extremely long waiting list for the Durham Housing Authority vouchers, something that's going to be even more of a crisis when they start to redevelop some of the older public housing complexes that are literally falling down. So it's tough. One of the ways this is also playing out is that Durham has the highest eviction filing rate of the state's largest 10 counties. And only a small fraction of those facing eviction receive legal representation. Last I heard, it was about 900 eviction filings a month, which is a lot. This map was done by DataWorks, and basically it's another color-coded scale where the darker areas are census tracts or census block groups that have really high eviction filings, down to the white, which have much fewer. The dark blue have between 491 and 2,361 eviction filings in 5 years. And so one of the big takeaways here is how gentrification and our general housing crisis we're in right now is actually reordering the demographics of our entire city. This is a map that I put together with Tim that I think is so telling. We used 2 data sets. First of all, we looked at the existing population in Durham neighborhoods in the 2010 census. And then we overlaid that with the race of people who are buying homes in each of those census tracts. And what you see is the dark purple are areas that from just 2012 to 2014 became 70% more white. The dark pink was 10 to 70% more white, and the light pink was 0 to 10% more white. And the only areas where there are more people of color are on the far urban fringes, essentially. And so for me, this is just a visual gut punch of what gentrification and our housing crisis are doing. Many people are having to move further away from their jobs and from their communities. So the big takeaway, the roots of today's housing crisis are 1, structural racism. And do people know what I mean when I say structural racism? Does anybody want that just clarified? Everybody's good.
Can you clarify?
Yeah, sure. So there's a couple different types of racism. There's individual racism, where people are just acting in terrible ways to people based on their race. There's institutional racism, where racial bias works its way into institutions and favors more positive outcomes for one group or another. And then structurally, it's a combination of all of those institutional actions, individual actions, and our culture that is able to transmit the system over time. The structural racism. And number two, an economic system, capitalism, that pursues housing profit at the expense of its use for living. So our entire economic system is designed to maximize profit on housing, not ensure that people have access to housing as a right. What do we do about that? I've been in so many conversations about this. Like I've lost track. And we can get into like a deep policy wonk conversation, but I think it really boils down to two main things. And it's not just me that thinks this. The Right to the City Alliance came out with this amazing report. The Right to the City Alliance is a network of grassroots organizations led by the people most affected across the country that put together this really great report. And one of the key pieces in that is that we need to be removing land from the market and placing it under community control. The way that we can do that in Durham, that I think is the best model that we have, is the Durham Community Land Trust. We can talk a little bit more about that later if people want to dig into that. There are other ways of taking land out of the market. The city and the county could buy more land. You can do worker or tenant co-ops. There's different ways that you can do it, but the model that we have up and running here is the land trust. And then there's this question of building political power capable of demanding more equitable distribution of resources. I think that we've seen in Durham in the last couple of years, we have elected a city council that is ready to do everything in their power to tackle this. And their power is mighty, and their power is, in the grand scheme of things, pretty limited. And so the next phase is we got to take over the state. We have to. We're preempted in so many ways of doing the things that we know we need to do. And so we could dig into either of those, but I'm just going to leave you with those two things to simmer on. And check out that report. It's free online. The executive summary is like 10 pages. It's really easy to read. So just wanted to end with this idea that I introduced at the beginning of moving from self-interest to political power, led by those most impacted. And just wanted to pose two questions. What is our individual self-interest in housing and land justice? And two, what are we able to contribute to efforts to build the political power necessary to change systems of governance and resource distribution? And as Durham for All likes to say, this is in the ballot box and in the streets, political power broadly defined. And so what I'd like is if we could take 5 minutes now and just pair up with a buddy and talk a little bit about self-interest and what you're able to contribute. It can be someone you know, it can be someone that you don't know, if you just don't want to move very far.
You can take it off of me. Just, I think the very beginning of her PowerPoint. I'll just put it at the very beginning of her PowerPoint. The first slide on her PowerPoint. You good if we just leave it on your slide? I don't have a slide. I'm real boring. So.
All right, just about 1 minute to wrap it up. Hello? Hello? Everybody has so much to say. Thanks, y'all. Does anybody have anything they want to share out? You don't have to, but if you want to, I'd love to hear it. Yeah.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jenny Sandil. Ethan and myself, we were just sharing
And one thing that's the big part about this is that the sense of community is lost. People's individualities are being shipped out. Like they can't enjoy the memories from when they're growing up because now they're being replaced with power. And so it's like that whole individuality, the sense of family and community is being replaced, and it's hard for people to adjust to those things because they're more personal for individuals instead of it just kind of being those material things.
Yeah, there's a woman named Mindy Fullylove who wrote a book called Root Shock, and she's a public health psychiatrist, and she talks about the psychological impact of losing both community and also the physical spaces that hold all those memories. And it's a really powerful book. Thanks for sharing. Did anybody else want to share? All right. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you. Okay. So we have one more speaker. So who is paying attention? How many evictions per month are there in Durham? 900, right? So this is a huge, you guys were listening, good. So this is a huge problem in Durham, and I got involved in this because I went to a meeting of the Human Rights Commission back in January to learn more about the evictions issue. And for context, I have a sibling with developmental disabilities who lives on SSI, and she went through an eviction from Section 8 housing last fall. And so just being aware that this is such a huge issue with a major impact on our community, I went to that meeting of the Human Rights Commission and I asked, like, what's the impact on people with disabilities? They could not answer the question, right? And they said they didn't even know how to answer it and that there was no data on that question. So I started talking to my comrades in the Democratic Socialists of America, the housing working group there. And my friend Mike Burrows, who's our doorman this evening, he put me in touch with some master's students in the public policy school at Duke, and they partnered up with the Alliance of Disability Advocates, which is a nonprofit. It's a center for independent living that services the Triangle and surrounding counties. So they put together a really amazing report outlining this issue, getting all the data together in one place. How does housing impact people with disabilities? So Dave Wickstrom, who's our next speaker, he's the executive director of the Alliance of Disability Advocates, and he's going to share the results of this brand new study with us now. Thank you.
Thank you. First off, I come for cookies, and so there's really good cookies back there. And so if you haven't had a cookie, don't eat them. 'Cause I want to eat them. So like she said, I am the executive director of Alliance of Disability Advocates, and we are the Center for Independent Living. We're federally funded. We're a small nonprofit, but we serve Raleigh, Durham, and the surrounding area. If you ask me what surrounding area is, I'm going to tell you what the federal government tells us, and it's surrounding area. So there you go. That's all I got for you there. We provide services to people with significant disabilities. Those are self-identified. So most of the time when you're thinking about if you're going to get services from any type of agency, you have to prove you have a disability. The cool things about the federal government says about us is you have to, only thing you have to do is self-identify. That's it with the significant disability. You don't have to tell us what it is. You can tell us to kiss your rear end. When we say, do you want to tell us? Say, kiss my rear end. We'll say, okay. We'll figure it out. We'll work through this together. And our goal is to get people with significant disabilities to live as independently as possible. Obviously, housing is a huge part of that. And so that's what when I came here in April 2016 from Kentucky, housing in Kentucky is an issue because there's just not enough. And but the affordable crisis here, everybody talks about affordability as a housing crisis, but we're not talking about the accessibility of the housing crisis as well. And that's another major piece that's going to be starting to come up. And so we got with Duke and the Sanford School, and we came out with this report. And I don't know if you all put your emails back there, but if not, we'll get those and we'll send that report out to you. We just did it. I'm going to go over very high level. I don't have a real pretty slideshow. Didn't know we were going to do one. So you're just going to have to listen to me and look at this shaved my face today. So just try to find.
Did everybody get a handout?
Yeah, did you get a handout? I made a pretty handout though. Well, I didn't. Staff member did. Give you a second. Everybody got a pretty handout? Isn't it pretty? Spent a lot of money on that. So one of the cool things, before I go on, a center, so you understand, a Center for Independent Living, 51% of our board is mandated by the federal government to be people with significant disabilities. I mean, it impacts 3 parts of their life. 51% of our staff are people with disabilities, and 51% of our management have to be people with disabilities. So we're consumer-led and consumer-driven. I am a person with significant mental illness, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about the significant mental illness piece of this today. But what I'm going to say goes around everything, any type of disability. We know that, and I'm going to talk in general, we know that the triangle area, so Raleigh, Durham, and Chapel, we know about 14%, people 16 or above have a disability in the triangle area, 14%. 5% of those have a disability where they use a chair on a daily basis. So obviously now, 5%, 14% is 5%. People in the triangle area, chair users, or use a chair to get around and live life. So when you talk about housing, are the doors wide enough? Think about that and the issues that they're seeing. WRAL, you see on the top handout says Wake County housing desert. Let me tell you why. 10% in 2010 affordable apartments. 10%. 2017 is 0.3. We got a problem, right? There's 26,000 affordable homes for low income. A shortage of 26,000. We have 1,800 housing units under our low income housing tax credit and 32,000 low income workers in the triangle area. You're seeing an issue. When I say working, we're not even talking about 5,300 people that make some minimum wage. Called 14. Not aware. You are allowed as a business to pay somebody with a disability sub minimum wage, literally pennies on the dollar, if they have a disability, through a certificate called 14C. One more, you for Goodwill. In 30 Rock, they did a big special on Goodwill. They kind of abused that. But sheltered employment, you're going to see that. I really want you to stay engaged in that. Sheltered employment. So when you're seeing things at Walmart, they're a big producer of sheltered employment. Some of their contract, building blinds. People with intellectual developmental disabilities, physical disabilities, diagnoses, is building blinds, and they're charging, they're billing Medicaid, and then they're on top of that, making a big profit, and they're paying them $1 an hour max. So now we're trying to people subhuman, and how do they afford housing? They're making $20 every week after tax. North Carolina. So when we talk about housing, if you're going to afford housing, you got to have a job. North Carolina is 37th in the country of housing with employing people with disabilities. It's a problem. We just don't house them. North Carolina currently is in the DOJ settlement. Because they have just housed people for the past forever, the mental illness. They shut the door and throw away. Put them in a jail. You see this a lot. And sometimes it's hard. And so as a staff at our agency, we have to empathize before we analyze. You don't understand. You don't understand what it's like growing up black. Privilege and white. Well, I got to shut up and ask questions what it's like so we can understand what is it like to have a mental illness and be put in an institution and told you're not good enough. Same diagnosis as me. Same issues as me. Yet they're sitting in an institution and I had a hell of an opportunity. And in North Carolina, we housing. So now the Department of Health and Human Services, they've been told, you got to get these people out. You got to get them in housing. We're helping with that. There's no housing. And if there's housing, we can't get them to afford it because we can't get them a job. So, and then if we do get them a job, we know that they earn 34% less than peers without a job. So now they're trying to job interview saying they can't even be themselves. They got to hide that they have mental illness. They can't be themselves. So that causes other things. And then on top of that, housing. What do people want? What do they make happy? One of those things is housing. So we have this mental health crisis in our country, as you know. Yeah, we don't have a housing issue. We have this housing issue too. So if we could solve a housing issue, we keep solving it. Maybe if we just solved it with housing. We solve the mental health. And how many people? And so we're looking at a lot of people with a disability live in poverty. It's more than twice the rate of the period without a disability. More than twice the rate. When we talk about people with disabilities and housing, we also need to start talking about if they can get a voucher, Section 8 or something called Key Targeted Housing here. If they can get a voucher, is the apartment going to be accessible? And if they're a charity or need a first floor, they're going to wait even longer. And then what if the doors aren't wide enough? What if bathrooms not accessible? Now they got to go fight to get it made accessible. So now we have another issue. So people with disabilities are having this piling on top of each other. And baby boomers, they're going to retire. And if you live long enough, you're going to have a disability. Your body's just going to stop. Your legs are going to stop getting strong enough. And something's going to happen. You're going to fall, break your hip. What's going to happen? And we're all one car accident away right now. We're going out and being care users the rest of our lives. Yet we're not thinking about that. We think right now, this doesn't really affect me with disabilities because it doesn't affect me today. Will affect you maybe tomorrow or tonight. Because I know there's a guy director of operations when he was in high school, hanging out with his buddies in Durham. And he lives in Durham today, doing homework. Some guy came by, brought by shooting, cherry. Never would have thought it. This world's great, and so we got a lot of issues going on. People that live on just supplementary security income, let's say the average is $35 a month, that can barely cover the rent of the lot. Just less than a one-bedroom apartment. It would take 93% of that check to afford rent in a lot of places. So how do you eat? How do you get gas to go to work? How do you pay an Uber to go to work? How do you go hang out with your friends? Which we know community inclusion, which I just came from a conference about community inclusion. Community inclusion is a medical necessity. Very clear. It is medically necessary for you to be included in your community. When you're not included in your community and you're separated, you're laying down all the time, like a lot of these people with mental health diagnoses in our state, people with disabilities, stop spiraling. I was trying to put a thing on, and our speaker today was the same way, and because I can sound smarter, like I said, I usually do. So I'm trying to add my feet. Maybe something will fire. Sound real smart. Be impressed. Probably not. So we know that not only their housing crisis, but when it's taking up all their check, they can't check in the community. They can't go have a gym membership to go work out and be healthy. So now they might have a house, but they're gonna have a heart attack. They can't afford to go work out, or they can't go out with their friends at dinner, or they don't know what to do, so they go into debt. And we got this keeps going, piling on and piling on and piling on. You're seeing, especially for people with disabilities. And like I said, baby boomers are still retire. So the baby boomers retire. Cheaper for us as a country to keep people in their own home instead of sending them to a nursing home. I think we all can probably agree that the numbers are there. Well, now homes are going to have to be remodeled because they were built a way for wheelchairs to go through, or ramps in them. To get a ramp in your home today, it's months upon months to get a ramp built for your home. So if you're living in an institution, or a person that has a newly acquired spinal cord injury, months before we can get you a ramp. Months. We can get it paid for. There's not enough builders. And when we talk about building things, we're going to talk about universal design. It's just not a sexy thing for builders. They don't care. They don't want to do that. We build with universal design. There's one of the most widely known design centers in Asheville, the Robert A. Mace Center for Design. And people just don't want to do it. But if you build a universal design, people can live in their home forever because the doors are wide enough. The ways around the kitchen are big enough. And if you're walking, you're crawling, you're in the chair, whatever you're doing, you live your life. So there's a couple things that we can do. We're going to get into a question and answer, but there's a couple things we can do. And in our report, we really looked at, and it's pretty in-depth. It's about 60 pages, and it has a lot of other links, so you can like nerd out like I do and hit all the links, and hit all the links in the next, research, and then you hit research and kind of go down a rabbit hole. You're up all night reading research because I know all of you are just like me. Trying to find a solution. But we looked at other cities that are just like us. What are they doing? Well, one of the first things we know they're building affordable housing on bus lines. Raleigh, Durham area, the fifth worst access to transportation in the country. What? Raleigh, Durham, what? Fifth worst access to transportation. How are we going to give people jobs with this job? Can't even get on fixed route systems. One of the cool programs they have is Home of Your Own. Ho-yo. But we'll say Home of Your Own. And it's pretty known. Some bigger cities, Austin does it. San Francisco, they do it. And it's to assist people with disabilities in purchasing a home. Actually owning a home. We know that home ownership helps people with their self-esteem, with getting a job, and friends, going out in the community. And so we're just not talking about rent. We're saying, hey, we need to get people to own homes. How do we do that? In Mississippi, they did this program, so it helps buy down mortgages, soft loans for down payments, closing costs, rehabs to current older homes, in home counseling. Before you buy the house and after they're counseling you on your finances. Mississippi, 75% the people who use this program were on SSI. We're talking $700 a month. They had less than a 2% default rate. And these people are owning a home. So, hey, let's get people to own a home. But let's really invest in it and stay in this home. There's also things called density bonuses, which is something that we're really going to start and we'd love to talk to you all about because we need a real grassroots effort to kind of talk to legislators about this. There's a lot of building codes. So Raleigh and Durham, both cities have recently done some building code updates to allow people to build outside of the restricted area for these small apartments or whatever they're building. If they make things accessible or if things affordable, or they have certain amounts of land, they leave land for a little park, little cute park. You could put 4 apartments in, you know, and then if we stack them, we could probably put a lot more. They get bonuses. What we're saying is, hey, you're already changing these. Let's say if you're going to have these density bonuses, where you're allowed to build outside, they not only have to be affordable, they also got to be accessible, and they got to be using universal design. And that's not something that's outside of the realm for them to do. It's actually an easy fix for people with disabilities, saying, "Hey, we got to make these things accessible." Because not only are they right now you're saying, all right, we have affordable to be able to live in. Maybe ain't going to be able to live in. You're saying the only people that can live in some of these are people without disabilities or without physical disabilities. Where are we putting these people with physical disabilities? Everybody's pissed that their taxes are going up. People with disabilities in institutions. It sounds, and so when I talk to people, I'm like, it just doesn't make sense that we're not investing, making things accessible. People will live there forever. So we have a lot of state and local buildings tackle for people with disabilities. This is really high. We'll make sure it goes out. We'll put it up on the event page. Really read it. Dig into it. It's really high view, real quick overview. We have a lot of different things. We also tackle our local elected officials. We go in detail. What are we passionate about? How do we in our talk getting a group of people together and saying, how do we tackle this person? This person has a family member with a disability. Man, we stalk. I don't want to say stalk. We thoroughly research people via the internet and trying to find out what are they passionate about. How does this involve education? Are they involved in housing stuff now? In Raleigh, Durham, and our state officials. And how do we really advocate to them about why this is important? And there's some money schemes in there that you'll see when you read it, talking about the savings when we do these things. San Francisco, some of these other cities are so far ahead of us. So maybe the research triangle is so far behind. And it's sad. We were at a board meeting. Aaron is on our board of directors, and we recently had a person we were serving who has a physical disability, and also didn't know people with disabilities have children, has a child, and the child actually has an intellectual disability, and their house caught on fire. It was a key targeted home. So as they got on the list, when we got an apartment, they were good to go, caught on fire. Well, you'd think they would just get enough. You go to the back of the list. There's nowhere to go, and so we had to advocate. Finally got them in place, and were able to get them in somewhere quickly. But there's issues. One thing goes wrong, people can be homeless, and then we're talking about is homeless shelters. Are they exist? I'll just let you guess on that one. And so the people with disabilities are us. I get it. I was very intrigued by Mel's way to look at it differently as well. Look at it a lot of different ways. And we can, as me as a white privileged man, I can use my privilege in a good way to help those that are less privileged sometimes. That's how I look at that. We do a lot of work in the prisons. We do a lot of work in housing. I can never be black. I know what it is to live like a black. Have that experience. What I can do is try to listen. But one thing we can do is we might not group we can all go into one day as a disability. have disability. We're 1 second away from walking out there, driving their car in here, and we have spinal cord injury.